Well, it's part of my favorite time of year when we get into November and we focus our hearts and our minds toward missions and our mission partners, and we put the flags up and decorate the worship center, and it's part of my favorite time. Next Sunday is actually Mission Sunday. We do have a special guest with us today. I'll introduce him in a moment, but I'm going to try to preach a shorter sermon so he has more time. Now, he's supposed to have time, I'm supposed to have time, we're both going to go over, so hang in there. You won't be disappointed, you will be blessed, and God is going to do amazing things today. We're in Judges, and things are going from bad to worse. God's people continue to turn their backs on God and do whatever they see fit. There's a common theme. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what they saw fit in their own eyes. And we see this play out in a drastic way today. We're looking at Jephthah. It's a crazy name. We're moving away from Gideon and Abimelech, his son, moving into an even darker period as things continually decline in Israel. Before Jephthah, there are actually, if you're reading through Judges as we go, you see there's 3 other judges listed, but they're only given a couple verses each, and there's not much said about them. And scholars call them the minor judges, not minor because of their lack of influence or lack of leadership, but just the time that they served is short. And we really don't have much information on them, and so we're not necessarily talking about those minor judges. The next one, though, that we have a lot of information on is Jephthah. Picking up in Judges chapter 10, verse 6 through 8. Again, we see that word, again. It's a cycle. The Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord. They served the Baals, the Ashtoreths, the gods of Aram, the gods of Sidon, the gods of Moab, the gods of Ammonites, and the gods of the Philistines. And because the Israelites forsake the Lord and no longer served him, he became angry with them. He sold them into the hands of the Philistines and the Ammonites, who that year shattered and crushed them. For 18 years they oppressed all the Israelites on the east side of the Jordan and Gilead, the land of the Amorites. Now, if you read on, it says they even cross the Jordan into and give Judah and Ephraim and Benjamin all kinds of problems too. But again, the Israelites did evil in the Lord's eyes. But this time, his patience is wearing thin. The narrator tells us that Israel cries out to God, and they even acknowledge, if you read along, they even acknowledge their sin. It's difficult to tell if they're genuine or not. The way God responds, it's clear his patience are wearing thin. God is tired of this cycle. He's fed up with his people. They continually turn their back on him. In other places, it's described as cheating on him, as having an affair. Even one, if you remember, they're prostituting themselves to these other gods. And God says, did I not save you before? Did you not learn your lesson? And then God says something that we, as we read this, we would never expect to hear God say. In Judges 10, 13 and 14, it says, but you have forsaken me and served other gods, so I will no longer save you. Go and cry out to the gods you have chosen. Let them save you when you're in trouble. And we read that and we're like, whoa. I can't imagine God ever saying that. He's like, I'm done. I'm done with you. I'm tired of it. Now, God is a patient God, and we are grateful for that he doesn't lose patience with us. He withholds his judgment for a time. He is faithful even when we are not faithful. And he wants more and more people to come to know him and repent and turn to him, know him. Actually, we learn he wants, in 1 Peter, he wants all people to know him. But even in our age, even though he's patient with us, there's a time coming when his justice will prevail and that patience will wear out. They did not turn back to God. They just said, do with us what you want. They did eventually, if you read on in chapter 10, they did eventually tear down some of the pagan idols and turn to God. And God said that their misery, he could bear their misery no more. And so even though he said, I will not save you, even though he said, turn to those gods that you are worshiping, let them save you, eventually he has to keep his promise. And their misery, he can bear it no more. And along comes Jephthah. Here's the description of this man. Chapter 11, verse 1. Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior. His father was Gilead. His mother was a prostitute. That's what we know about Jephthah. What a description, right? How would you like that? How would you like that to be your description of who you are? Now, because he was born of another woman, now the language doesn't necessarily mean that she actually received money for sexual favors. It could actually mean that she was just a very loose woman and got around. I know, we're being very graphic today. I warned you guys in week 1. But regardless, he was born of another woman, and so his brothers ran him out of town. You don't belong here. And so they ran him out of town. Now, things got bad for Gilead, and so his brother's like, he's the mighty warrior. He's the one who can really help us during this time. And so they go and they said, come save us. We need your power. You're a mighty warrior. Come and save us. And the Spirit of the Lord, this is what it says in chapter 11, the Spirit of the Lord was on him. And that's pretty amazing. We don't see that with all the judges. Some of the judges, we don't know if God was really with them or not. But Jephthah had the Spirit of God on him. And so victory was going to be his. But even though God said that he would not save them, he is faithful because that is who God is. And Jephthah then does something incredibly stupid. Something just incredibly dumb. I mean, he already had the Spirit of God on him. The victory was Jephthah's for the taking. But Jephthah goes and makes a vow to God. He made a vow to God to offer up a burnt offering if God would be victorious for them. And this was a mistake on Jephthah's part. You know, vows are very important to God, and actually in the Old Testament, there's a lot of warnings about breaking your vows. You must keep the vows you make before God. Jesus even discusses this in the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus says, don't even make a vow. Just let your yes be yes, your no be no, because vows are so important. And if you break them, there are big consequences. Jephthah made a vow that if God gave him the victory, the very first person who would come out of his house when he returned from battle, he would offer up as a burnt offering to God. What an incredibly dumb vow to make. Now, there's a lot wrong here. I'm going to give you 3 things that are wrong. And then there's some questions, and there's one big question that I will address after we go through these wrong things. Also, just so you know, there's some differing interpretations of what this vow actually meant and the follow-through of this vow, and I'll touch on that as well. First off, he should have never made a vow in the first place. God's Spirit was on him. God gave him the victory already, so he was wrong in even making the vow in the first place. Secondly, and this follows closely to the first point, he made the vow because he was actually using God to get the victory. He was actually trying to manipulate God and use God as kind of the genie in the bottle. God, if you do this, then I'll do this. And sometimes we play that game. God, if you do this, I'll go to church every week. God, if you do this for me, and God becomes kind of the genie in the bottle. And so he was wrong to try and manipulate God. Third, he should have broken the vow and not kept it. And I've already talked about the importance of keeping the vow, but he was wrong for keeping this vow. And you might be wondering why I would say that. Well, here's what happens. The vow was that the first person who comes out of his home when he returns from battle would be offered up as a burnt offering. Anyone could have walked through that door first. It could have been a servant. It could have been his wife. We don't know much about his wife, but we do know he was married because he had one daughter, a young girl. And I think he knew it could very possibly be his daughter that came out of the house first. Some scholars believe the language could actually include his livestock, like a sheep or a donkey or an ox, meaning it could have been an animal. But do you know who walked through the door first? Do you know who came out to greet him as he returned from battle? It was his one and only child, his young daughter. Now, I believe the chances of his daughter coming out first were great, and I think he probably knew that. I think that, we see scenes in movies, right? When the warrior comes back from battle, there's an entourage and a celebration, and it's always the child who sees them first and runs out to meet their dad who's been off fighting the battle. I remember just coming home from work when my girls were little and how they would be looking out the window for the car to drive up, and they'd get so excited, and I'd come through the door and they would run and hug me and be so glad to see me, even after just being gone for a day's work. I mean, imagine what it'd be like if I came back from battle. I know it's hard to imagine. But they're so excited to see me, and then they get to be a teenager and they don't care, right? But his daughter, the chances of her being the first one to come out were great, and I think he knew that. And even if the language does allow for it to be livestock, I can't imagine a sheep being able to open the door and be the first one out. Proverbs 20:25, Solomon, the wisest man ever, says this: "Don't trap yourself by making a rash promise to God, only later counting the cost." Jephthah does appear to be distraught when he sees his daughter come out of the house. It's a horrific scene, and we are reading that, watching this play out, and really beginning to scratch our heads. We can't imagine him going through with this. How could a man sacrifice his daughter because of a vow that he made to God? Now, if you're familiar with the story, you know that scholars have tried to soften this story up a little bit. Scholars have tried to reinterpret it to make it more palatable for us who are reading it. And they say that there's room in the language to mean that he didn't really sacrifice his daughter. He just offered her up to be a service to the temple for the rest of her life, and that she would live at the temple and serve God there for the rest of her life. This simply was a dedication for her to service of the Lord. And that is easier for us to deal with. Man, it would be great if that's really the case. But when you begin to look at the text, there are clues that really eliminates this from being a possibility. It tells us that he is going to make a burnt offering. He is distraught when she comes out of the house first. And really, if the language does allow for an animal, if it was an animal, he would have sacrificed it. We know that. He's not going to dedicate it to the temple. If it was a servant, he would have sacrificed it. But because it was his daughter, we look for an easier explanation, one that's not so cruel and depraved. Now remember the theme of Judges. In those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what they saw fit in their own eyes, and this includes Jephthah. The text tells us that Jephthah did what he had promised, and from that point on, again, this is another indication that he really followed through with this and sacrificed his daughter, that the women of Israel every year commemorated this event. And the narrator says even up to this point, they do this. And again, if it was just a temple dedication, would they have commemorated that year after year after year, remembering Jephthah's daughter? The times were dark in this period, and they're actually only going to get worse. And so here's the question. Here's the big question. As we read this story, the question is, why doesn't God step in and do something? Why doesn't God prevent this from happening? In Judges, we already seen in chapter 10 that God is withdrawing from his people. They continue again to do evil in his eyes, and they keep turning their back to God and worshiping other gods. And so God begins to withdraw. He told them he would no longer save them. And I don't think God's making an example of this young girl. He simply turns people over to their wickedness. After a certain time, God says, fine, that's the life you want to live, live it. And the people we see in Judges end up living the very evil that they chose, time and time again. And what happens to this little girl is tragic, but it's a product of their wickedness. We can't blame God for the bad things that happen in this world. Even though we want to blame God. God, you didn't show up. God, you didn't do this. God, why didn't you intervene? But it was the people's wickedness that caused this tragedy. Why didn't God intervene? He let the people have the life they chose. Now, we ask the same questions of God. When we go through struggles, when we go through suffering, we're like, God, why don't you do something? Why don't you stop this from happening? Why didn't you intervene? Why didn't you step in? Well, we ask that at different points in our life. And you might be asking it now. Well, God, why don't you do something? And these are questions we cannot answer. And so we have to turn to what we know to be true. Who God is. Here's what we know. Just because God is silent doesn't mean he doesn't care. And I'm going to go through these pretty quick, so if you're writing these down and you don't get them, you can email me, I'll give them to you. Just because God is silent doesn't mean he doesn't care. Just because God seems distant doesn't mean he's not with you. And just because God doesn't intervene doesn't mean he doesn't have a plan. Because we know that in our story, God does intervene. He might not intervene in your specific context and circumstance, but he intervenes on a hill called Calvary 2,000 years ago. He intervened when Jesus went to the cross. That's the biggest intervention known to the world. That God stepped out of heaven and became flesh and lived among us. And experienced everything that we experience. All the emotions, all the temptations, all the things that we go through, God experienced in the flesh through Jesus Christ. And on the cross, Christ died for us. That's how God intervened. And so God might not intervene in your specific context, in this world, in this day and age, but he has intervened, and you will see it in glory. You will experience it in eternal life. Do bad things still happen? Of course they do. Do people still suffer? Absolutely. Do we have the promise that all things will be made right and that God's justice will prevail? You better believe it. The people during the time of Judges, God left them to live in their evil ways. He left them to live in their wickedness. But because of Jesus Christ, thankfully, we don't have to live that way. We have hope in Jesus. We have the promise that God stepped out of heaven and came to this earth, ultimately to die for us, rising from the dead, conquering death. And whoever believes in him will not perish but have eternal life. Thank you, Stanley. That's a good way to end it. We're gonna transition a little different. We're gonna let the live stream stop, and we thank everyone who's joined us online this week. Have a great week.